characteristics, emergent properties of life is to be able to reproduce. And so we're going into here, looking at reproduction from just only an animal standpoint. So reproduction is the production of a novel new individual. And in animals, it's pretty obvious when we create a new individual. In other clades of life on Earth, like plants, it gets to be a little fuzzy. Okay, sometimes you have certain trees in a forest that their roots are all connected together. So do we have one individual, or is all those trees just one individual because they have cytoplasmic connections, or are they individual trees? It gets to be difficult. With animals, it's pretty clear. And so this production of a new individual can be sexual, involving meiosis, or it can be asexual. Okay? So asexual reproduction is producing offspring that are identical genetically to the parents from which they came. And oftentimes with animals, asexual reproduction seems to be connected with animals that are living in very stable environments. Okay? Marine habitat primarily, where things don't change very rapidly. It's very rare among terrestrial animals because terrestrial habitats change very rapidly and frequently. And so some of the types of reproduction that happen here, asexual among animals, is fragmentation. And this can be accidental fragmentation, or it can be intentional. For example, sea anemones. We used to have an aquarium with saltwater aquarium when we had the old building 8, and we had some sea anemone in there, and you could watch them sometimes. They like a cell dividing. There would be a cleavage that comes down them, and they would just eventually split in half. It took a couple of days for it to happen, but fragmentation. Also can be accidental. So if you like flatworms, they have very high ability to regenerate lost parts. You can take a flatworm, and I used to do this in lab, cut them into 3 pieces, and students, there was a lab that I used to do, and you'd have to look at every time you come into the lab, you have to feed them and look at them, and over the course of 3 or 4 weeks, is that usually the head would grow a new tail. Sometimes the tail would grow a new head. Okay, and so they just come back together. Earthworms can do that too. Starfish, they're also capable of regenerating. That's just fragmentation. These are some of the phyla, the groups that we talked about in which fragmentation is a possibility. Budding, okay, this is where you have unequal mitosis on one side of the body. And so it grows and grows and eventually breaks off and is a baby individual. But this is very frequent with hydras. In fact, this is a picture of a hydra, and this is a growing bud that will eventually break off and become another hydra. And this is asexual. The new hydra is genetically identical to the hydra from which it came. And this is asexual. Or fission. This is what, well, I said fragmentation, actually for the sea anemones, it's this, because they divide in 2. Fragmentation, they break into several different parts. And all of these are asexual. But it seems like this type of ability, as animal bodies become more complicated and their genetics becomes more complicated through the evolution of animals, is that the regenerative powers have become less and less. You can't cut off your finger and regrow it, but a lizard, certain lizards can break off the tails and regenerate the tail. Our powers of regeneration are very, very limited. We can heal wounds, but we can't grow new parts once they're cut off. Okay? Sexual reproduction. This is real common. Okay, so asexual is among some of them. The sexual reproduction is very, very common all throughout the whole animal kingdom. And this here involves the fusion of gametes, sperm and eggs. And as a consequence, we have shuffling of genes, as what we talked about when we went over meiosis, mitosis last semester, is that there's 3 different ways in which genes are shuffled during sexual reproduction. What are the 3 ways in which their genes are shuffled? What?
Recombination.
Recombination, crossing over. That's one. What's another mechanism? Shuffles of genes.
Independent assortment.
Independent assortment. Alignment of chromosomes. What is another one? What is the third one? It's even on the screen, in fact. The random fusion together of gametes. Okay, that's a random event, but it shuffles different chromosomes, different genes, alleles. So this creates genetic diversity, which is probably reason it probably evolved is because of evolution. Okay, selected by evolution, it creates variation upon which natural selection can work. So the gametes in animals, they're produced by meiosis. Okay, so we're going from diploid cells to haploid cells, and they take place within the testes and ovaries. Eggs are produced in the ovaries, and sperm in the testes. In animals, there are some animals that have both testes and ovaries, and they're referred to as being monoecious. Okay, so they're neither male nor female. Usually these animals outcross, but sometimes they're self-fertile. Okay, now self-fertilization in plants is very common, but not so common in animals. So one example is earthworms. When they come together, that they will mutually exchange sperm. Okay, so when they mate, they both have a copulatory organ which they put into a gonopore in the other individual. They mutually exchange sperm, and they store that sperm in a spermatheca. Okay, until the right time to be able to fertilize their own eggs. So they don't fertilize their own eggs with their own sperm. Okay, now usually this is when this monoeciousness is pretty common when it's rare to run into a mate. And so with earthworms, that's the case. Here they're in the soil, can't see anything, and so you can have two earthworms that are perfectly compatible that would just pass each other like ships in the night. Okay, they would never see each other. So when they do run into each other, they make best use of it. All right. Burrowing animals, that's the case. Furthermore, it's also common among animals that don't get around too much. Okay, this is called the agility, the ability to move. And so certain types of aphids, for example, that do not have wings. You know, they don't spread, they don't get out, they don't move too much. Therefore, lack of mobility leads to lower chances of running into a mate. Okay, therefore, when they do, they make the best of it. Yes.
So because I'm not monoecious, you feel like that's actually itself.
No, it's rare. Some things can, but most of the time no. Okay, as I said, monoeciousness in plants, that they sometimes are self-fertile, but usually animals aren't. Even though they have, because there's proteins, compatibility proteins that are on the sperm and eggs, and if they don't have the right combination, then fusion just does not take place, and so that's prevented. Okay. And as I said, usually these animals, even though they have both sperm and eggs, they are usually outcross. They store sperm in a spermatheca that they get from, when they get the sperm from the donor. And they can keep that sperm alive for quite a long time until it's an appropriate place to be able to fertilize its own eggs and then leave those eggs in the environment. Usually there's very little parental care. Usually they're just deposited and then parents go away and you never see them again. Other animals have separate sexes, they're dioecious. Okay, so one type of individual in the population or in the species are males. They have testes and produce sperm. Others are females and they have ovaries and they produce ova, eggs. Most vertebrates happen to be dioecious. Now, fertilization can happen inside of the body or outside, so it can be external. A lot of marine animals and aquatic animals, it's usually external. In that the eggs and sperm, they're just released into the water. Now, still the males and females, if they're dioecious, still have to be close together, because if you go, if one one animal is on the west side of the Pacific and the other one on the east side of the Pacific, and they just release their sperm and eggs, there's no way that they're gonna come into contact. So they still have to do, a lot of times have mating rituals or behaviors that bring them together into the same vicinity, but then they would release the sperm and eggs into the water medium, and fertilization takes place outside. Okay? For example, here, that's what happens with frogs. Now, this might look like copulation. That's the male. Okay, that's the female. But that's not really what's happening here. This is still external fertilization. It's a behavior that the frogs have. The male will grasp the female and ride on her back until she releases her eggs. Okay? This is called amplexus, and so there's no copulatory organ here whatsoever. So once the female releases her eggs, then he lets go of her. He doesn't care about her anymore. Okay, it's the eggs, and so he stands over the eggs, releasing sperm to fertilize the eggs. And in many species, it's the male who stays there and guards the eggs. Okay, in some cases, the female goes away. Internal fertilization is almost obligatory for terrestrial animals. Okay, because there's no way in the air here that two individuals can just release sperm and egg into the air. It doesn't work that way. Furthermore, the air is very desiccating, and therefore sperm and eggs dry up. So this is a mechanism, internal fertilization, to preserve water, okay? Because then the watery material in which the sperm is dissolved is transferred into the moist, watery environment inside of the female, where fertilization can take place. So those that are terrestrial that have internal fertilization, annelids, insects, spiders, and all amniotes. And this requires not only copulatory organs, but a lot of times ritual behavior. Ritual behavior, that mating behavior that coordinates the activity of the two individuals in passing the sperm into female. Okay, wait till you get that. Now, there are some marine animals, however, that do have internal fertilization. So for the marine habitat, it's not universal that it has to be external fertilization, but external fertilization is more prevalent in the marine habitat. Yes?
Do we consider something like a seal a marine animal? Or?
Yeah, but it's a mammal. Okay, they have evolutionary history in whales. They evolved from land fully terrestrial mammals. Okay, and they've returned to the marine habitat, but they're still carrying the amniote legacy. Okay, now for internal, to go over some patterns of post-embryonic development in land animals primarily. We use this word egg sort of in an ambiguous way. It can mean two things. One is it's the gamete that is fertilized by a sperm. Okay, more proper word for that to reduce that ambiguity is to call that gamete instead of an egg. Call it an ovum. Okay, that would be much better. But nonetheless, we've been using the word egg. But egg is also the structure that an embryo develops in. Okay, so like we start out with a chicken egg, a bird egg. First it's a gamete. Okay, it's a gamete. It has one nucleus inside of it. It has a lot of yolk. Okay, once it gets fertilized, we have a zygote still within that same structure. And when that zygote starts to divide, becoming a blastula, it still is in that same structure. And so here the egg is a place where the embryo is developing until it reaches a stage that it can hatch out of the egg. So that's what I'm referring to here with this particular type of classifications of post-embryonic development. Some animals are oviparous. In fact, a lot of them are. And this means that during embryological development, the zygote is turning into a juvenile that can be hatched out of the egg, is that there's no direct material connection between the female's body and nutrients and the egg, the embryo itself. So these eggs usually have to be large, and all of the nutrients for developing an embryo has to be inside of the egg, and we call that material yolk. And so it stores of certain types of proteins that store amino acids only long enough for those amino acids to, proteins to be broken down so the amino acids can be used in the growth of the embryo, and carbohydrates and so forth. Everything is nourished by yolk. So this is insect spiders. Monotremes, although they're mammals, they're still egg-laying, and therefore they have to have yolky eggs. Another pattern, besides oviparous, is something in between, called ovoviviparous. In this case, all the nutrients are still provided by yolk inside of the egg. Okay, so once the egg has been fertilized, there's no exchange of materials between the mother and the embryo. However, they retain the egg inside of the uterus until it hatches. And then the young are born live. They crawl out of the vagina with, not as an embryo, but as a young animal. Now, what do you think the evolutionary advantage would be of this type of thing?
Keeps them from being eaten.
Yeah, because usually the oviparous critters, they just lay eggs and run away, okay? They're open to anything to come in and eat them. But here, they protect the eggs. Now, there's both an advantage and a disadvantage. It would be a disadvantage.
They would be incapacitated.
It would encumber the female carrying those eggs around and make her more likely to be prey for some animal. Okay, so it sort of works a little bit both ways. It's a trade-off. And then, so sharks. Some fishes, some reptiles, they happen to be ovoviviparous. And then we have viviparous. This is where the embryos are nourished by direct, so that, yes, the zygote and blastula are retained in the uterus of the female, and there's some sort of provision by nutrients, fluids from the mother. And these can be variable. We usually think of placental mammals as the big example. I mean, it is a big example for viviparous, but this is not the only group of viviparous animals there are. There's some things that are related to houseflies that they are also viviparous. They don't have a placenta, okay, but they have glands in the uterus that the maggots, because once they develop so far they're maggots, that they latch onto a gland and they're sucking juices that are provided by the mother, okay? So it's not a placenta, but we still regard that as viviparous. In mammals, this is due to a blood connection between, a capillary connection in the placenta between the baby's blood and the mother's blood. So viviparous. Now there's some interesting things that have evolved in some animals that are sort of still regarded as asexual to a certain extent, but they develop from sexual systems. Okay, so it's sort of a backwards type of evolution. It's called parthenogenesis. So this is development of individuals from unfertilized eggs. Okay, eggs are produced by meiosis. Okay, usually that's a sexual cycle, but here this is asexual in that there's no fertilization of the egg. This is what is referred to as parthenogenesis. And there's several different types. Something called apomictic parthenogenesis. And this is what the egg fails to undergo, or the germ cell fails to undergo meiosis, which results in an egg that is diploid. Okay, so suppressing meiosis, the germ cell goes through certain stages, but it still retains two sets of chromosomes. And therefore, since it fails with meiosis, it already is diploid, and it can start growing by mitosis. And so this is apomictic parthenogenesis. And so here it still has the genes from the mother. And so it is identical genetically to the mother. It's a clone. And it's common in different groups of insects. Now, there's also something called automictic parthenogenesis. And this is where the second polar body fertilizes the ovum. If you remember what happens here with meiosis. You have a germ cell that is diploid. And when it's produced in animals that produces eggs, it'll undergo meiosis 1. And this is something I haven't gotten to, because I'll get to it a little bit later in this lecture, is that in mammals, or many insects, most animals, is that meiosis 1 is asymmetrical division, just like it was in plants. Okay? So there's one that takes most of the cytoplasm, this one little cell that will play no further role. It is called a polar body. And it is the first polar body. And a lot of times it disintegrates. This is now haploid. And this cell will undergo, once again, meiosis 2. And it's also an asymmetric division, producing what will be the gamete, the egg, and the second polar body. This still has a set of chromosomes, and these then fuse together to produce the zygote. So it's not fertilized by sperm. The chromosomes come from the same individual, from the mother. Okay? All these are different forms of parthenogenesis. So they lay a diploid egg. They lay a diploid egg, yes.
I saw this on Minecraft, but I thought there were like 3 haploid polar bodies.
There's another one. What's that?
I saw something on Minecraft where it said there were like 3 haploid polar bodies or something.
3? No.
And
This-
after
this-
the second mitosis.
Does it say?
Yeah.
Is it
I read
three
that.
haploid polar bodies and like one haploid
Yeah.
at the end of meiosis?
That's interesting. I'll look that up. This is the way I'm pretty sure this is the way it works. So this was in your mind tab.
Yeah, the last.
Okay.
So,
The third one.
so
I will look that up, because I don't see how they can come up with, in plants, yes, that's the way it works. But in animals, there's 2 polar bodies.
So what's going to be going in second meiosis? What is going to be?
Okay, so what we have in the first meiosis results in the oocyte and the first polar body.
And those are both N?
They're both in. Yeah, because it's meiosis 1 that is the reduction division. Okay, that's where they have separated. Meiosis 2 is just like mitosis,
Mitosis, yeah.
but we still have this asymmetrical division. This polar body, it's possible that in some animals it will rise again, and that might be where it's getting the third one. But that's not very often that happens that I know of. That could be a possibility. I'll look into it. But either way, the polar body plays no further role. And then, so we end up with just only one ovum that is functional.
So only that, what's it called, an oocyte?
Oocyte.
The oocyte goes through meiosis, not the polar body is just.
Well,
outside now?
meiosis takes 2 divisions.
Uh-huh.
But once we go from primary oocyte, we're going from, and I'll get to it a little bit later here. This germ cell, we have a germ stem cell, and it will produce a diploid cell that's called the primary oocyte. Primary oocyte, when it divides, it results in a secondary oocyte and first polar body. When this first polar body, it could divide.
Oh, okay.
That might be where the third one's coming from, okay? But it's going to be erratic, some might happen in some animals, but not in others. Okay, either way, it plays no role, okay? Primarily, this has all the factors necessary for survival, usually that does not. So when this secondary oocyte then undergoes mitosis two, produces a second polar body, and now this is an ovum. Now, that's going to be more complicated when I get into it a little bit later, because I'm going to get into more details of what's happening here, because that's simplified what I just did. So your mind cap, when it's getting the three polar bodies, is probably because of the first polar body dividing. Okay? Now there's even something more interesting. This is in one group of insects called Hymenoptera. Okay, this is order of insects. These are ants, wasps, bees. Ants, wasps, bees. And it's a big order. You know, we have, I think, well over 100,000 species of these things. And this is called haplodiploid. It's still formed a parthenogenesis for the males. Okay, so this is for the males only. Because the males, they develop from unfertilized eggs. They're haploid. They are haploid. Whereas the females, they develop from fertilized eggs. They're diploid. And so here, sex determination is determined not by particular chromosomes, but by sets of chromosomes. So if it has one set of chromosomes, it's a male. If it has two sets of chromosomes, it's a female. Okay, and a lot of these insects in Hymenoptera are social insects. What I mean is that they live in large colonies. So ants live in a large colony. That's universal through ants. Many bees happen to be social, not all. Some of them are solitary. But in these social insects, usually that is run completely by females. Males are very, very rare. So there's a queen that the males are called drones. This came around before the electronic devices that you see flying up in the air. So drones, those are the males. And the female, the queen, since she only needs the drone to mate with. And then once they're mated, she stores the drone's sperm in the spermatheca. And she can keep that spermatheca, or that sperm, active, and she can choose when to fertilize an egg or not. And usually if it produces fertilization, because it goes down the oviduct, spermatheca's right there, and usually it's one sperm. It's very economical, you know, unlike other animals that usually millions of sperm cells during copulation, but only a few eggs ever get fertilized. This is usually pretty much 1-to-1. And if it's fertilized, it will be a female. And they're usually slaves, workers, okay? And depending on what they're fed as larvae, they will develop into soldiers, they'll develop into workers, they'll develop into foragers, etc. But all of them are females. The males are hardly ever there. Producing a male only when the colony gets big enough that they need to reproduce and start a new colony. And so there will be both females, reproductives, male reproductives, have wings. If it's an ant, they have wings, and they fly away. Okay, mate and start a new colony. So the drones are only there for mating, and usually once the colony gets going, the drones don't do a damn thing, and therefore the females just kill them, get rid of them. They don't need to be there. So this is a woman's world, okay? And that's all in here, okay? So it's interesting style of life. Okay, that's enough comparative stuff. Now we're just going to look at mammals. Yep.
So how do they like produce queens? Like how are they different from females?
How do they look? We like?
How are they different from females? The queen?
Yeah, they can actually, yeah, that's, it depends on the food that they were fed. Yeah, because there are certain factors, it's a complicated, interesting thing, because it affects whatever they're being fed, because they're fed by other workers. And like if the queen dies, the queen is producing pheromones, okay, that controls the behavior of the workers. And if somehow she dies, that pheromone disappears. And the workers, that changes their behavior, okay, some of them. They will start feeding some of the larvae a different type of a combination of food, and that affects gene expression, okay? So all this is a complicated system that is changing the gene expression within, and we can get then a pupa that will develop in, well, okay, it was a larva, it became a pupa that when it hatches it becomes a queen, but it's based on what they were fed. Yeah, so,
Can
okay.
multiple queens be born or hatched? Can multiple queens,
In ants, certain ants. We have an invasive type of ant here in mostly southern part of the United States, and we got way into California as well. They've displacing a lot of native species of ants, they're called Argentine ants. And they have interconnected colonies and multiple queens, and this is one of the reasons they spread real fast. Most other hymenopterans usually just one queen.
how do they control that? Is it the
It's by the one queen's pheromones. It controls gene expression of, and whatever the larvae happen to be fed. The workers are programmed by the pheromones to, that the queen is putting off inside to feed, make a certain mixture of food, to feed the larvae, and due to that, that controls their gene expression.
So the larvae just happens to have those pheromones for a queen or what?
Well, yeah, because once it becomes a queen, they produce those pheromones, because it's a matter of gene expression. Okay, so we have a larva, and the queen is, we need a new queen. The workers feed her what's called queen substance. I don't know what the makeup of it is, but that's still during the pupal stage, that changes the gene expression during pupal development.
The only feed is the one larva?
But there could be more, there could be more, there could be more. Especially if it's a colony that's too big and needs to swarm, okay, move somewhere else, divide up into two or more, okay? So that's when they would produce multiple queens. They wouldn't necessarily keep the same colony, but when they fly away, because these queens will be small, have wings, and they'll be drones, and they fly away, taking some of the colony with them and starting a new colony. Yeah, but yes, they'll have the pheromones when they eclose. They'll be producing that because that was programmed to the food substance they were given while they were pupae. Okay, yeah, and there's a lot that's not known, understood about this, but that part is.
So that a current queen could like cause the creation of a new queen by like causing
Yeah.
the parent. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's get into mammals. First of all, I'm going to go through the anatomy, or first of all, the production of sperm in males, and also the anatomy of males, usually using humans as our model here. And then I'll look at the female system. Female system, you're going to find out, especially the hormone control, is going to be much, much more complicated than what it is in males. So the production of sperm in males is still meiosis, but it's called spermatogenesis, production of sperm. And it is in the testes. Now you look at the testes, they look like a solid structure, but just like the kidneys, it's filled with tubes. And the functional units within these tubes, within the testes, are something called seminiferous tubules. So this is a simple squamous epithelium, okay? And males have miles of this wrapped around inside of the testes. And this is where all the business meiosis takes place. First of all, anatomy, okay? Going through the anatomy of a male, so this is cut sideways. This is, okay, testes outside the body, okay, in mammals. Why? They're in a bag called scrotum. Why are they outside? Is because spermatogenesis has to occur at a lower body temperature, or lower temperature than core body temperature. Why that has evolved in mammals, we don't know. Because the testes in other animals such as snakes, lizards, and birds, it's internal. Okay, it's not outside. Okay, and so it's in here that we have the seminiferous tubules. And so as sperm is produced, it's stored in a sac that's on top of the testes called the epididymis. So the produced mature sperm is not stored in the testes itself, but it's in the epididymis. During ejaculation, There's muscular actions. The sperm is inactive. Tails are not moving, but it's projected out of the epididymis into a cord, a tube that's called the vas deferens, that enters in front of the pubic bone. There's two of them, one on each side, and go over the urinary bladder and down behind the urinary bladder, where the two vas deferentia come together into a single tube that is very, very short. That very short tube is called the ejaculatory duct. They don't have it up there? No, they don't. And there's a single tube, and it empties into the urethra just below the bladder. And then it's propelled out of the bladder, or out of the penis. The penis has erectile tissue, and so you cut through it. This is where the urethra happens to be. But there is special types of tissue here that what leads to the erection is more blood is coming in than what can come out. And so it's blood pressure. Blood pressure. There's no bone there, okay? There's no bone. It's blood pressure. And so hydrostatic pressure, there's hormones and also nerves that control the arteries that are going into the penis. And so more blood is coming in, this area fills up, and this is what gives the erection. Other important things here are certain glands, okay, surrounding the, do I have those glands up there? I'll talk about them in a moment. So, or next week. Right underneath the bladder is a gland that's called the prostate gland, okay? Now these glands, they add to the sperm, okay, the semen. They put fluid material into it, and these materials in this fluid have certain functions, which I'll get to probably next week. So another gland, so this urethra is going through a channel, it's surrounded by the prostate. Okay, the prostate is completely around it. When older men start having prostate problems and they start getting bigger, they frequently will squeeze the urethra and they have urinary problems. They can't urinate very well. And a lot of times it has to be dilated, or there's certain types of drugs that you have to give it to them to relax the muscles in the prostate. Another important gland here, not real important, but another male accessory gland, just at the base of the penis, there's two of them, one on each side. It's called the vulvourethral gland. And then behind the bladder and entering into the ejaculatory duct, there's a pair, left, right, of seminal vesicles. So all of these add secretions to the sperm. The sperm volume itself is very, very little. Even though we're talking about millions of sperm cells, the sperm cells are really, really small. So most of what is ejaculated are substances that come from this seminal vesicle and the prostate. And they have certain functions that I'll talk about. So if we look at it from the anterior side, looking at it from the front, here's the epididymis, it's in the scrotum. And incidentally, the scrotum contains muscle, smooth muscle, that responds to temperature. If the testes are too cool, then those scrotal muscles will contract and pull the testes closer to the body. If it's too hot, those muscles relax and the scrotum becomes more of a bag, the testes further away. Because the temperature affects, in mammals, affects spermatogenesis. Okay? All right. Yeah, in fact, that has a particular name to that muscle, Dargos muscle. Now, I'll go through this real quickly, then I'll review it again on next week. These accessory glands, they're adding, so really, these two words, sperm and semen, are often used interchangeably, as if they're the same thing. Sperm cells are the reproductive cells, period. Semen is what's ejaculated. It contains sperm, but that isn't the only thing it contains. So it's the secretions, sperm plus the secretions, that come from these two glands. Seminal vesicles, amino acids, fructose, that's an energy supply for the sperm. The sperm cells are mostly just a nucleus with a tail. There's no there are mitochondria at the base of the flagellum, but it requires ATP, okay, or it has to have an energy source to produce the ATP. There's not storage there, and so it's picking up this from the, once it's deposited in the vagina, this is the energy supply. Prostaglandins, actually, I'm going to go, that's gonna take you too long to go through all this. I'll go ahead and stop here. Okay, so, Monday's quiz, it starts with the kidneys. Okay, since I reviewed the kidneys, on Tuesday, everything about the kidneys, the anatomy, blood supply, the, counter current flow, et cetera, all the way up to here.